This module is an overview of the EPA, the Clean Water Act, and water quality standards. Now, normally, headquarters puts on this academy, and there's a lot of the students don't know much about water quality standards, and this is a very helpful module. This is a fairly high-level audience here, and so a lot of what's going to be in this module you probably already know. Some of you may not know, so that would be a good thing you'll learn. And also, a lot of you may be very specialized in a particular field, and you know your field very well, but you don't know others, and so hopefully there'll be some information here that will benefit everybody. But I think that at the minimum, it's going to create the structure for what this academy for the rest of the week is going to be all about. So there's the infamous disclaimer in the second slide. Basically, don't believe a damn thing I say up here. So welcome to the Water Quality Standards Academy. So this is the overview of the module. Basically, we're going to talk about what the EPA is, its mission and the structure, what the Clean Water Act is all about, the difference between laws, regulation, and guidance, an overview of what water quality standards are, the scope of water quality standards, who do they affect, how water quality standards are implemented, what it means is the water quality-based approach, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a few minutes. General implementation processes, and the roles of states and tribes and the public, EPA regions, and EPA headquarters. There we go. Okay. So, what's the Environmental Protection Agency? The EPA was established in the executive branch on December 2nd, 1970, pursuant to Reorganization Plan Number 3. No single environmental statute at that time. The laws were enacted when a particular environmental issue was seen as needing national legislative and regulatory action. EPA's mission is to protect human health and the environment, air, water, and land, upon which life depends. EPA is a regulatory agency because Congress authorizes it to write regulations that explain the critical details necessary to implement environmental laws. EPA also teaches people about the environment. Protecting the environment is everyone's responsibility and starts with understanding the issues. EPA is led by an administrator who's appointed by the President of the United States. It endeavors to abate and control pollution systematically by proper integration of a variety of research, monitoring, standard setting, and enforcement activities. EPA also coordinates and supports research and anti-pollution activities by state and local governments, private and public groups, individuals, and educational institutions. EPA reinforces efforts among other federal agencies with respect to the impact of their operations on the environment and is designed to serve as the public's advocate for a livable environment. It's based on research and has responsibilities to educate and to regulate to reduce the impact of human actions on the environment. So this is how the EPA is organized. It's hierarchically organized. It employs 18,000 people about in headquarters program offices, 10 regional offices, and 17 labs across the country. Primarily, those 18,000 people are technically trained staff, more than half of whom are engineers, scientists, and environmental protection specialists. And then there are also legal, public affairs, financial, and computer specialists. So the EPA, the head office is the Office of the Administrator, and then there are some sub-offices that of which we are in the Office of Water, and each of these sub-offices have an assistant administrator that works under the administrator. The EPA also has 10 regional offices, and each region is divided up by geographic location. So we're obviously in Region 9. The DC headquarters happens to be in Region 3. And we'll talk in a few minutes about what the role is of the regions versus EPA headquarters. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I was just curious where they fit in the org chart, the regional offices, but then I put my hand down because it sounds like you might be about to say that.
So the regional offices are actually underneath the administrator. So
they'd be the same box?
They would be the same boxes
Okay.
as each of these boxes underneath the administrator. Okay, so these are the regions. Okay, so now just the Office of Water. We're drilling down into the hierarchy. Several organizations that make up the Office of Water. There's the Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds, the Office of Science and Technology, where I belong, the Office of Wastewater Management, and the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. Policy, communications, and budget staff support the overall operation of the Office of Water. In addition, water divisions in all 10 regional offices work with stakeholders to implement all programs. There's an organizational chart also in your electronic materials. And the role of the Office of Water is to provide agency-wide policy, guidance, and direction for EPA's water-related programs. And these include water quality, drinking water, wetlands, marine and estuarine protection, and other programs. Oops. And there's also, I wanted to mention, Office of Water also has a National Environmental Justice Coordinator, and each EPA region also has an Environmental Justice Coordinator who serves as a point of contact to assist with addressing issues related to overburdened and vulnerable communities. So EPA is responsible for implementing all or parts of these important environmental statutes, which includes the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, as it's often called, the Clean Air Act, or CAA, the Safe Drinking Water Act, SDWA, affectionately called SIDWA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, TASCA, they call it, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, as it's called, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or often called CERCLA, the Safe Drinking Water Act, I mentioned that already, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, or FWPCA, which actually we often refer to as the Clean Water Act, or it's often referred to as acronyms CWA, Clean Water Act. Other environmental laws EPA plays a role in is the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, Endangered Species Act, Beaches Environmental Assessment and Coastal Health Act, which is often called the Beach Act, the Marine Protection, Resources and Sanctuaries Act, and Coastal Zone Reauthorization Act amendments. Oh, there's also the Magsaysay-Stevens Act. Essentially, it's a fish habitat. It's a fish. It has to do with fish habitat. I apologize. Yes. Oh, here you are. Come on, Manjali.
You're doing great. All right. Okay, again, thank you. Sorry, everybody, for you have a lovely city here. I had a really nice Uber driver, too. Give me the tour and everything on the way in. Okay, so we are on slide 8. Okay.
Take a minute to introduce yourself.
Oh, that is a brilliant idea. My name is Russo Vlcan. I am a team leader in the Water Quality Standards Program at EPA headquarters. I started off at EPA in the drinking water program, but very quickly ran to the standards program, have been there for 20 years. And so all the wonderful people who helped Region 9 and State of California plan this academy work for my group. We run the DC academies that we normally have, and we cover a variety of subjects that you will be hearing about today and throughout the week, including uses, anti-degradation, variances, compliance schedules, all the like. So I will be here all the way through Wednesday, and then one of my team members will be coming in and we'll be flip-flopping, and she'll be here for Thursday and Friday.
Welcome.
Thank you. You guys are so nice. Okay, let me get myself oriented again. All right, so we're talking about the history of the Clean Water Act. Okay, its volume is good. It's very loud in my ear. Okay, so congressional statutes have talked about water all the way back from the 1800s. There was a Rivers and Harbors Act, which focused on protecting navigation routes. But really, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was really kind of the beginning, and that was in 1948. And it's the root of the modern Clean Water Act because it focused on protection of water quality, not just for navigation. And in 1972, it was amended to add many of the key programs we're familiar with now and we're going to talk about. And that's when things started being called the Clean Water Act, when the act itself started being called the Clean Water Act. From a nomenclature standpoint, you'll notice, I think in one of your handouts, that there's a crosswalk between like the Clean Water Act numbers and the Federal Water Pollution Control numbers. The Clean Water Act numbers are the 3-digit numbers, and the Federal Water Pollution Control numbers tend to be 4-digit numbers. It gets us confused too because the lawyers like using the original numbers. Now the modern Clean Water Act includes some changes that have happened along the way. You'll see this here. For example, the construction grants that were added in 72 were replaced in 87 by the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Also, there was a section that involved the Great Lakes that was added in 1990. And we'll talk about this later, but then our regulations followed that with our Part 132 regulations for the Great Lakes. Okay, so now the amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act were really important because it really did establish some major requirements that enhanced the legal mechanisms to protect clean water. At the 50,000 foot level, sort of at the big level, what it really did was it established the basic structure for regulating pollutants discharged into the waters of the US. It made it unlawful for any person to discharge any pollutants from a point source into a navigable water unless a permit was obtained under the Clean Water Act provisions. It funded the construction of sewage treatment plants under the construction grants program. It required each state to adopt water quality standards, states and tribes to adopt water quality standards for all intrastate waters, and provided for EPA review for approval or disapproval. And we'll go into that more today as well as throughout the week. It also required meaningful public engagement in the process of establishing water quality standards. So why does the Clean Water Act matter? So this slide has been in here forever. And so at some point, I mean, it's kind of nice that we don't have any more recent examples, but this is focusing on the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. I don't know how many people have heard this spiel, but in less than 50 years, the Clean Water Act has had a big impact on improving and protecting our nation's waters. But it's not always easy to realize where we've been and where we've come. So the Cuyahoga River is our, example. So on the left, you'll see a picture of a moment when the Cuyahoga River itself was on fire. And the right is sort of modern day Cuyahoga River. So it's located in northeast Ohio. At one time, the Cuyahoga River was the most polluted river in the United States. And the reach from Akron to Cleveland was completely devoid of fish. At least 13 fires were reported on the Cuyahoga River, the first occurring in 1868 and the largest in 1952, which burned for 3 days and was reported to cause over $1.5 million in damage. Then in 1969, a river fire captured the attention of Time magazine, which described the Cuyahoga River as the river that oozes rather than flows, which is not something that I think anybody in Ohio really wanted to be known for. But the impairment of the river actually helped spur the environmental movement in the late 60s, and is one of the reasons that the Clean Water Act was sort of kicked into high gear. And it shows what can be done to help restore impaired waters. So again, the picture on the right is modern day. The picture on the left is is when it was burning. So what kind of things happened? Well, one, the Clean Water Act and the EPA regulations that were implementing the act were put into place, and federal EPA and Ohio EPA were created. And all of these, along with public involvement, brought a lot more attention to sources of pollution to water and how to start remedying the problem. So there's still environmental problems today in the Cuyahoga River, just like there is in the Anacostia or the Potomac or probably the Sacramento or the American. But the point is, it doesn't catch fire, so that's progress. And there are fish in the water, and people can kayak, so that's pretty good. So again, it's an extreme case, but it's sort of an indication that, while progress might be slow, it does happen, and in a real way. Okay, so some Clean Water Act trivia. Does anybody actually know who it was that brought the Cuyahoga River water quality problem sort of to national attention? And I didn't really expect you to know. So really, there was actually an Associated Press convention happening in the area at the time, and it was an Associated Press reporter from Baltimore that decided to do a story on it. The local AP didn't even notice it because it was apparently such a normal thing. So this guy from Baltimore wrote it up, and all of a sudden it ended up in the news, and that's what sort of started the whole thing. Congress passed the Clean Water Act amendments of 1972 through a bipartisan vote. How many of the 377 House members at the time voted for it? Anybody know? Not quite. Close. It was 366 to 11. That's pretty good, right? Now, when did President Nixon sign the Clean Water Act amendments of 1972? Wow, you guys are so smart. He did not. What happened? That's right, he vetoed, and then Congress overrode it. Yes, awesome. That's actually one of the more fun. For whatever reason on the East Coast, people don't always realize that it's hard to imagine Congress overriding a veto these days. So people don't usually go down that road, so it's kind of fun. All right, so objectives and goals of the Clean Water Act. So the objective of the Act listed in Clean Water Act 101 really is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. The Act established an interim goal that's saying wherever attainable, the goal is to achieve a level of water quality that provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water. So these are phrases that you're going to want to remember, particularly the interim goal. That really is the backbone for the Water Quality Standards Program. We will spend a lot of time this week talking about what is meant by protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife, and recreation in and on the water, and wherever attainable. So just, commit that to memory at some point. But in addition to these goals, the Clean Water Act also had a policy to prohibit discharge from toxic pollutants in toxic amounts. And it also specified that the national goal of elimination of discharge into navigable waters to be by 1985, which we didn't really quite meet that, but we're still working towards that in theory. So to start off, we're going to talk a little bit about the distinction between the statutes, the regs, and the guidance. It is a hierarchy, so Congress establishes, and most of you probably know this, so just pardon the review, but Congress passes the statute, which is the Clean Water Act, so that is law. And then the executive branch establishes regulations to implement the law. So EPA, as a regulatory agency in the executive branch, we passed our Clean Water Act regulations to expand on and describe how to implement the Clean Water Act, or portions of the Clean Water Act. Both statute and regulations are requirements. They're musts. You have to do them or something bad happens. Guidance and policy they don't have the force of law. They're shoulds, but they're really our attempt, or the executive branch's attempt, to try and bring real words to help understand the best way to implement the regulations so that you can meet and be consistent with the Clean Water Act. Under the Clean Water Act, there are two approaches to maintaining and protecting water quality. There's a technology-based approach, and there's a water quality-based approach. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the technology-based approach, but the entire Water Quality Standards program is on the water quality side. But to understand, the goal of a technology-based approach is to really, it's just to achieve a very specific level of treatment. So its focus is on, like our agency will identify a bunch of dischargers and identify what is the best performance treatment and control technologies that that type of industry can and should be implementing, taking into consideration what's available and costs and all that sort of thing. And then it sets sort of a bar thing that, all pulp and paper mills need to at least achieve this standard. It doesn't dictate exactly what they have to do, but in reality, they came up with that based on what they know is the technology out there. So technology-based effluent limits are really derived from those effluent guidelines. On the other side is the water quality-based approach, which is really about thinking about what the water needs. What does what are the standards? What are the water quality standards? So it focuses on figuring out, identifying what are the limits of the pollutants that can go into the water to actually meet the needs of the water. So whether it's fishing or recreation or any other sorts of uses. And with that information, it is, you develop, permit writers would develop water quality-based effluent limits that are derived from the water quality standards that apply to that water body.
Clarify, this is for NPDES permits?
Yeah, so that is basically this is the precursor to the MPDS stuff. Yeah, so QBELs, so 402 permits would include either T-BELs would include both T-BELs and water quality-based effluent limits. It's a more stringent one of those two that'll drive the controls. So another way to look at it is you've got your water quality standards. If your technology-based effluent limits won't get you to protecting the water quality standards, then you got to go to the water quality-based approach, and it'll obviously be more stringent. So people will sometimes say, yeah, technology-based limits. And they think that they're talking about one but not the other. So the important thing to understand is to achieve water quality-based effluents, you're likely to still need technology. It's not like there's some, it's magic or something. It's still technology. A lot of times, when you're talking about technology-based effluent limits, it's based on technology performance standards. When you're talking about water quality-based limits, you're talking about limits in pollutants to make sure that the waters are going to meet their water quality standards, but dischargers are still going to need to install technology to get to those limits. So just as a way to kind of make sure that you don't get confused. Yes?
So as technology advances, do you reevaluate the technology?
On the effluent, yes, they do. I mean, not that often, but they do. They do revise the effluent guidelines. That is actually our sister division that does that. Any other questions since we paused? Okay. Okay, so water quality standards. So the Water Quality Standards Program really is a joint effort between states, authorized tribes, and EPA. It's sort of the core of the water quality management programs that establish the goals for a water body. Water quality standards regulations, our water quality standards regulations, the federal ones, outline the minimum water quality standards requirements for states and authorized tribes when states and authorized tribes are writing your own water quality standards. There are some minimum requirements in order to meet the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act specifies that states, territories, and authorized tribes are supposed to adopt water quality standards to protect public health or welfare, enhance the quality of water, to serve the purposes of the Clean Water Act, including sections 101A, 101A2. Those are those restore the chemical, physical, biological integrity, and protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife, recreation, and on the water. So states, territories, and tribes will establish water quality goals for a water body and provide that really provide the regulatory basis for all controls that after that. States, territories, and tribes can choose to be more stringent. There is a section of the Clean Water Act that gives that discretion. It's section 510. EPA cannot disapprove a state tribal standard because it's more stringent than necessary. Our purpose is to make sure you are at least doing what you're supposed to be doing under the Clean Water Act and protecting what you're protecting. But the discretion to go beyond that is all at the state tribal level. We have been asked by certain entities to disapprove where entities feel like states are being more stringent. We have the ability to ask to make sure that there's a reasoned basis for it. So it's not some sort of predatory standards type of a thing, but we can't disapprove. That discretion was given by the Clean Water Act. Another thing to note is that since 2000, any new or revised water quality standard has to be approved by EPA before it can be effective for the Clean Water Act, under Clean Water Act purposes. Before that, that wasn't the case. If EPA was a little slow on the uptake and we didn't approve them, they were still effective until we did something affirmatively about it. There was a court ruling and a subsequent rule that changed that process to say that the burden is the other way around. It's got to be stamped as consistent with the Clean Water Act before it can take effect. All right, so where do you find EPA's water quality standards regulations? So after being published in the final register as a final rule, a regulation is codified by being published in the Code of Federal Regulations. The Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR for short, has 50 volumes, each called titles, and then they focus on a particular subject. Title 40 is the protection of the environment. So all of the regulations we'll be talking about today, this week are in Title 40. The Volume 40 title, so in parts 131 and 132, that's where the water quality standards regulations are. I believe you have copies in your folders or somewhere in your materials. 131 are the national water quality standards regulations. Part 132 are the ones that are specific to discharges to waters in the Great Lakes system. These regulations serve the basis for EPA's review. So when we review and make approval or disapproval decisions, we take them based on whether or not they are consistent with the regulation and therefore consistent with the act. That is our job. If we can't explain why it is or isn't, then we have a problem. So in all our action letters, we should be explaining why something is or isn't consistent with it. And then the other thing to note is that our original regulations were established back in 73 after the Clean Water Act. We revised it in 2015. It's the only time we've really done anything with those standards regulations. So the ones that you'll see now were most recently done in 2015. All right. EPA guidance and policy. So as I said before, these documents are intended to assist states authorized tribes in implementing the water quality standards. They are not musts. We do not base any of our actions on whether you did or didn't do what we said in guidance. That is intended to help. There's no public notice and comment required when we issue guidance, because again, it's basically our recommendations on the best way to proceed. It isn't binding. I already said it's not a basis. It is governed by sort of the Administrative Procedures Act, which may or may not involve Office of Management and Budget review. In my 20 years, I have found that it kind of goes like this. They either want to talk to us or they don't want to talk to us about our guidance. But some of the important guidance documents that we have are going to involve our Water Quality Standards Handbook, any FAQs that we might have, and memos that come from EPA managers. We have we do a lot of our communication by a manager at headquarters sending correspondence to management in all of the 10 regional divisions to ensure that there is national consistency in how we are advising states and authorized tribes. Obviously, there are unique differences amongst the regions. So taking it from there, the regional management can then decide what's best appropriate for their regional area. Yes. Oh. Sure.
Does EPA's guidance change every time there's litigation that results in a judicial decision? And if so, how is that applied consistently?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I wouldn't say our guidance changes every time there's a legal decision. Usually when there's a legal decision, that decision applies in that particular district, or whatever the level of the court is, and it's that basically becomes law. Like, we'll talk about it. Based on common law, that'll be common law in the area. We don't usually change our national guidance for that. The region may. I don't know, Terry, if you've had to do that yet, but I think, depending on what kind of a decision it is, there may be different guidance. I will say, there's a couple big ticket examples. One example that I can pull off the top of my head is when it comes to de minimis for anti-degradation. So this is a little bit ahead, but for people who are familiar with it, anti-degradation is the part of our program that allows states and authorized tribes, or requires states and tribes to at least establish a policy to protect existing water quality and high quality waters. It's part of the maintain component of the Clean Water Act. And there's a process that's involved. And over time, there's been this concept of de minimis, which we'll talk a little bit about, where some states and tribes will say, well, if it's a trivial amount of change, then we'll just accept that. And we don't say whether that's okay or not okay, but there has been litigation on de minimis. And it's been significant enough that we did put in the preamble to our 2015 rule, we did recommend to states that if anybody does want to do de minimis, describe it clearly and take note of the consistent rulings that have occurred across the country on de minimis. Things like you can't go more than 10%. So that's one particular example. But in terms of I will tell you we're in the process of rewriting our Water Quality Standards Handbook. So some of those kinds of things will be in there, but it wouldn't be for every court ruling. Only for the ones where we're like, yeah, there's no way we can really recommend doing anything more because the court's got it right, and they've got it right consistently. Any other questions? Okay. All right. I'm going to go quickly because actually that was really good timing. So this slide, really the only additional point is that where there is a court ruling on an interpretation of the statute and the regulations, that does become common law in the area where the court decision was held. And generally, common law is where courts are held to their precedent or the decisions that were previously made in that same court. In rare occasions, such as when things go to the Supreme Court, those decisions can be national in scope. The agency also has a choice as to whether or not to apply a regional decision nationally, sort of in the similar way that she was asking about whether it changes our national recommendations. It might, depending on whether we feel like the court got it right or wrong. All right. So we'll get into a little bit more substance. So as we said, the water quality standards define the goal for the water body. What is the purpose? What is it that you want to do with your water body? And so it becomes a legally binding basis for protecting, assessing, and restoring your water body where it needs restoring. There are three main components, three required components. That's designated uses. Some people call them beneficial uses. I think in California you call them beneficial uses, right? So that's really, again, that's saying, what do you want to do with that water? You want to allow for fishing. You want to allow for shellfish harvesting. You want to allow for swimming, those sorts of things. Then there's criteria to protect the use. Again, this is just the limits on the pollutants. So how much of X pollutant can you have and still maintain safe use of that water for what you've declared that you want to use that water for? And then anti-degradation requirements, which are, again, sort of a way to ensure that whatever water quality improvements you achieve, there's a process to maintain those. So you're not constantly achieving great stuff and then using it all up again. As an option, states and authorized tribes can adopt general policies, for example, on low flows, mixing zones, variance authorizing provisions, compliance schedule authorizing provisions. None of those are required, but if a state or authorized tribe chooses to adopt those as legally binding, those become subject to EPA review as well. Okay, so as we move into some of the more substance part of it, we're going to go through a schematic that should just sort of set the stage. So to the left of that vertical solid line is sort of where your water quality standards sit. You've got your designated uses, which reflect the state or tribe's management goals for the water. You've got the criteria that are intended to protect the use. So obviously the arrow is there because what criteria you have depends on what use you want to protect. And then there's in the anti-degradation portion of it, which is intended to protect existing uses, which we'll talk about, high quality waters and outstanding natural resource waters. On the right of that line is where all your implementation is. So on the left, you've sort of established like how it is you want to protect your waters, and on the right are the mechanisms that are used to actually do exactly that. And it's done in different ways, using different mechanisms. First and foremost, it's done via 402 and PDS permits, which are limits to discharging pollutants to certain waters. Those 402 permits must derive from and comply with water quality standards. So what that means is that permit writers need to be looking at the water quality standards, often very specifically at the criteria, and they write their water quality based limits based on those criteria, so that they can ensure that the discharge coming out of a facility is not going to cause or contribute an exceedance of the water quality standards. Some other ways that water quality standards are implemented through is through Clean Water Act Section 404, dredge and fill permits. Those are usually done by the Army Corps. Any other federally licensed or permitted activities, which would be covered under Section 401, where 401 certifications, where states and tribes can certify whether or not any federal permit is actually meeting their standards. And again, you'll have a whole module on that. And then there would be other Clean Water Act mechanisms, things like 303D, which are impaired waters listings, TMDLs themselves, the 305B assessment of waters. All things that we'll talk about here when we break it down, which we will do. So basics, I'm going to give you real basics. You're going to have like 1 hour modules on each of these. Thanks, Gemma. So I think I'm going to have to go a little faster. All right, so designated uses. Again, these are uses specified in the state tribal water quality standards that define what your goal is. It's really about what functions or activities that you are supported or you want to support in that water quality. Protection, propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife, recreation in and on the water, public water supply, agriculture, drinking water, industrial supply, all sorts of things. But the ones that are underlined are the ones that are the part of the interim goal. Protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife, recreation in and on the water. Those are ones where the Clean Water Act said wherever attainable, those need to be protected. So the way the program is set up is that those uses need to be designated to protect those purposes unless shown that that's not attainable. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then there are also tools. Designated uses are also a way to communicate to your public what you really want to do with the waters in a plain language kind of way. The other prohibition by the Clean Water Act is that you cannot designate a water body for waste assimilation. Okay. Now, water quality criteria are the water quality levels that will protect the designated use. EPA defines criteria as elements of state water quality standards expressed as constituent concentrations, levels, or narrative statements representing water quality that supports a particular designated use. When criteria are met, then generally you're expected to protect the designated use. It says generally because that's not always going to be the case, but that is the idea. The idea is you've identified what criteria you need, that if you meet that, you have every reason to believe that you will be protecting your designated use. EPA's requirements for criteria is that it must support the most sensitive use. So what we'll talk about is that you can designate multiple uses for a particular water body, and they all might have different criteria needs. Where the criteria are related to the same parameter, you have to make sure that you're protecting the most sensitive one there. It's got to be based on sound scientific rationale, not economics. Sound scientific rationale. It's based purely on science. And then you have to have sufficient parameters to protect the designated use. So what that means is if you've got a particular use, you can't just pick 2 parameters if you know that there are 10 parameters that could affect the ability of that water to achieve an aquatic life use. All right. Oh, yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the most sensitive use? Let's say some uses can be potentially conflicting, like agriculture versus low flow from fish.
Well, that's a really good question. We haven't, we don't really say anything about what you do when there's a true conflict. The question is whether there really is a true conflict. So for example, if you've got pollutant X and you need, in order to protect use A, you need really low numbers, and in order to protect use B, you need really high numbers. That doesn't happen all that often, but that's just sort of one of those case-specific situations that you just kind of need to work it through. I don't know, Terry, you have anything else to add? Anybody else? Okay. Thankfully, it doesn't happen all that often.
The classic one is bacteria, wreck, and shellfish.
Right.
I was just going to remind everybody to try to use the microphones.
And I needed reminding. The classic competition is the recreational use bacteria and the shellfish use. One is lower than the other. So if you're in bacteria TMDL, you should be shooting for the lower one.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Terry. All right. Oh, here it was. Okay, so types of criteria. So there's a whole lot of different criteria you can have. Aquatic life, human health, bacterial, biological, nutrient, site-specific, anything that you can come up with, really. There's nothing prohibiting anybody from coming up with their own type of criteria. Usually when EPA recommends criteria, it's somewhere in the aquatic life, human health, bacteria, biological, nutrients kind of realm. But some states have water quantity, hydrology-based criteria as well. But really, the important thing to note is that you have 2 forms of criteria, either numeric or narrative. EPA recommends, the Clean Water Act gave EPA, or directed EPA, to come up with 304A criteria recommendations, which we do. We provide numeric criteria recommendations. Again, they're just recommendations. States can either use those numbers, modify those numbers, or come up with their own scientific way of coming up with numeric numbers. Narrative criteria can be used either where numeric criteria can't be established or to supplement those numeric criteria. Both criteria, when adopted, are still a basis for any implementation decisions. So when it comes to, for example, narrative criteria, you usually need to have translators so that the permit writers know how to translate it into a numeric effluent limit.
Numeric, you're saying states can establish numbers. Do those numbers have to be below the recommendation?
No, they can be. They just have to protect the use.
Are we going to talk more about supplementing versus supplanting later in the course?
In the criteria, maybe in the criteria module, but that would be a good time to talk about it.
Are the national criteria usually national numbers applied nationally, or do you have to look?
So the question is, in case you couldn't hear, is whether the 304A criteria recommendations are national or if they're ever regional. They can be regional. So like our nutrient criteria are based on ecoregions across the country. All right. Anti-degradation, we've talked about this a little bit. It's just a way to make sure that there is a process to protect existing water quality and high quality waters. It's done by establishing 3 tiers of protection. Aside from making sure that all waters are protected at the existing uses, tier 1 is essentially like existing uses, which we'll talk about. But in terms of tier 2 and tier 3, the difference there is in tier 2, it's really more of a procedural to make sure that there's a process to decide whether or not you want to use some of that assimilative capacity when you have high quality waters. And tier 3 is for those really highly valued waters, you don't allow any degradation. And I actually will be presenting the anti-deg module on Wednesday, so we'll talk more then. There's also mixing zone policies, low flows, things that we already talked about. So I'm going to blow through that. What are the 3 core components of standards? Just yell them out. Yeah, you got it. Okay, uses, criteria, and anti-degradation. All that mumbling, I think I heard it. 3 types of water quality criteria. I think this was going for like aquatic life, human health, that sort of thing, but that's okay, you guys got it. It was literally 30 seconds ago that we talked about it. Okay, where do water quality standards apply? It applies really waters of the US. Really, all waters of the US need to have water quality standards. Now, what is a water of the US? Someone else will talk to you about that. But they have to apply to waters of the US. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to skip this because really the module is just going to be more informative to you. And, okay, do I really need to ask you this? Are any of these waters of the US? No, right? Okay. Huh? No, Terry, I'm sorry, it isn't. Okay, so what activities? We got point sources and non-point sources. Point sources are defined in the Clean Water Act. Okay. Point sources and non-point sources. Point sources are discrete conveyances of pollutants. They are regulated. Non-point sources are any source of water pollution that doesn't meet the definition of a point source. Things like polluted runoff that carry junk into the waters. That is not explicitly regulated by the Clean Water Act. Point sources are regulated by MPDS permits, judge and fill permits, 401 certifications. Non-point source pollutants, we all know they are a major source of pollution for our waters. Really, the discretion goes to the states to decide how to control non-point sources. It's not explicitly covered, but there are several points in the water quality standards regulations that really are intended to make the state or authorized tribe really think about whether you really want to be controlling your non-point sources. We try, but there's really only so much that we can do. But there are a lot of other mechanisms to try and encourage non-point source controls. There's 319 grant funds, there's agricultural programs, there's local organizations that have helped create sort of support structures. Some of you have heard about like sort of the water quality trading programs. And then some states are using innovative approaches, using like even water quality standards variances to trigger cost share requirements so that point sources can pay into non-point source funds as a way to meet their permit limits. So people are getting creative. Just in case anybody's interested, that example I just gave is Wisconsin. They happen to actually have a regulatory program, but the way they structured it, it could also be done outside of a formal non-point source regulatory program. I'm going to skip this one because we all know water affects everyone. And environmental justice, this is really about the treatment and meaningful involvement of all people affected by water quality, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. And there was a directive by President Clinton that all federal agencies need to make environmental justice a high priority. This is actually coming up a lot, and you'll see later on when people start talking about whether costs are an impediment to being able to implement controls. It's a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing because waters are polluted. It might cost a lot to treat those pollutants and to clean that up, but the communities that would be impacted and have to pay for those costs are your disadvantaged communities. And so because you can't afford them, then they're the ones that get the dirty water. It's a very real scenario right now that some of the people who are debating what affordability means are really trying to figure out. All right, implementing water quality standards. We saw that. Okay, this is a good wheel to sear into your brain. Water quality standards, center of the universe. If you don't believe me now, you will by the end of the week. It serves as sort of your whole basis for the water quality program. And okay, I can walk. Okay, so what I would say is if you're looking at this, you can start in 2 different ways. This half is really about, let's just say it's sort of your normal, ideal way where you do what you're supposed to do and the waters are meeting their water quality standards. This half is what happens if it's not meeting its water quality standards. So let's start with, you write your permits to meet your water quality standards. So the idea is to make sure that your discharger isn't discharging too much to violate standards. You monitor your results. You conduct your monitoring and assessment. You realize, yes, my water is meeting its standards. We're all good to go, and you just kind of keep going. But if you monitor and assess and you realize it's not meeting your standards, then what happens is the state will identify which waters are impaired, which will then prioritize which waters need to have TMDLs written for them. TMDLs being total maximum daily loads, which is really a pollution diet, which really talks about how to ratchet it down so you can reduce the pollutants enough to meet your standards. All things we'll be spending lots of time on talking about. And then you implement the TMDLs, and then permits now are written to be consistent with the diet that was established in the TMDL itself. And this one is pretty much the same thing. This is sort of when you're assessing and reporting on impaired waters, there are two ways that states do this. It's part of the integrated report. I'm sure most of you know this, but it's really the integrated report will include your 305B reports, which is really your assessment of the health of the waters based on whether or not they're meeting their standards. And then that informs a 303D list, which is which waters are impaired and need to be in the prioritization queue for a TMDL. On the other side is actually restoring your waters through your TMDL, pollution diet. The TMDL calculates the maximum amount of pollutants from all sources. And then for the point sources, those are the waste load allocations that serve the basis for their permits. I'm going to skip this because it's pretty self-explanatory, but it's really just talking about sort of what is the state of our current waters. I'm going to take 2 minutes more because I can. Okay. So in terms of roles, all right, so I told you this was a collaborative approach. There are states, territories, and authorized tribes, the community and public involvement, EPA regional offices, and EPA headquarters. Everybody plays a role in making sure that the water quality standards are really reflecting what is needed to protect the waters and proceeding to do what needs to be done to protect the waters. States and authorized tribes have the primary authority to establish those standards, but when you do, you have to submit them to EPA because they're not effective under Clean Water Act purposes until EPA approves them. They need to be reviewed on a triennial basis. So what that really means is the state or tribe needs to hold a public hearing at least once every 3 years so that the public has an opportunity to provide input on whether or not those should be changing. If we were all honest with ourselves, we know that every state does not do these triennial reviews on a 3-year basis, but I know everybody does it as soon as they can. Some states have gotten clever and have started doing things on a rotational basis where they do something on a regular basis, but they focus on different basins. All we're asking is that you involve your public and you try and do it as much as you can. EPA will not do it for you. People have tried to compel EPA to do it for you. We will not do it for you. But what we would do is that if, as a result of not revising standards, there's been a big problem, that's when we might step in. All right. Any submission needs to include the revisions that have been changed or anything that's new, any supporting information, certification that those standards were adopted consistent with state law, and evidence of public participation.
Can you say specifically what comprises the certification for the state?
It's really just a letter that's usually from the Attorney General or somebody who's duly authorized that will say, these standards were adopted and are consistent with state law. Okay, so regional offices are really the ones delegated. So EPA headquarters supports the regional offices, but it's really the regional management that are the ones that take the approval, disapproval action. This is pretty self-explanatory. And then here are our take-home messages. Clean Water Act establishes a national goal of waters that provide for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife, recreation in and on the water. The act and the regulations are the basis for our approval.
In the case of revised water quality standards, if between the time of being approved, disapproved, or EPA not acting, say you need to promulgate because you didn't approve or disapprove, does the pre-existing standard stay in place until something new happens, or what happens?
Yes. So the only time what's applicable changes is when EPA formally takes an action. So if we approve, then the new standards come in place. While we're reviewing and everything else, your previous standards remain applicable for Clean Water Act purposes. If we disapprove, this is the funky part. Even if your state law has changed, we will say what was previously approved and effective under the Clean Water Act remains in place until until the state either adopts something else that EPA approves it, or until EPA promulgates replacement standards. That's a good question.
Hi. Will we have triennial review sessions separately? Discussion triennial review process.
I think we'll talk a little bit about it in the Water Quality Standards and Review module that's towards the end of the week. All right, I'm here at least half the week, so you're welcome to ask me questions. But again, you're gonna have a module on almost every single one of these topics. So this was just your teaser, intro kind of a thing. You'll have like an hour on each. So, all right, thank you, and sorry for the coughing fits.